Brandon Carter was just a young mechanic with a quiet life and big dreams when a single moment shattered everything. Accused of a violent robbery he didn't commit, Brandon found himself thrust into the unforgiving world of the justice system. The evidence seemed damning: eyewitness accounts, fingerprints, surveillance footage, but something about the case didn't add up. Sentenced to 60 years in prison, Brandon faced the harsh realities of life behind bars, clinging to his innocence and the slim hope that someone might one day believe him. That hope begins to flicker when an unexpected ally, a respected judge haunted by doubt, uncovers a forgotten piece of evidence that could change everything. As the layers of corruption start to unravel, Brandon's fight for freedom becomes a battle against a justice system built to bury the truth. Along the way, he discovers the strength of resilience, the impact of unexpected kindness, and the power of a community willing to fight for what's right. But will the truth come to light before it's too late? And how far will those protecting the lies go to silence him? The air in the Sacramento County courtroom was thick with anticipation. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, casting golden streaks on the polished wooden benches packed with spectators. The soft hum of whispers fell silent as Judge Walter Grayson entered, his black robe brushing the floor with each deliberate step. At 62, his sharp gaze and firm demeanor had earned him a reputation for fairness, yet he was unyielding when it came to justice. Before him stood Brandon Carter, a 24-year-old man whose life was unraveling faster than he could comprehend. His clothes, simple white shirt and gray slacks, provided by his public defender, hung loosely on his lean frame. Shackles at his ankles clinked with every slight movement. His eyes, hazel and full of quiet defiance, betrayed his attempt to appear strong. Brandon's hands trembled slightly at his sides, but his back was straight, his jaw clenched. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses and spoke in his deep, measured tone. "Brandon Carter, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of armed robbery and aggravated assault. Your actions have caused significant harm, leaving this community scarred." Brandon wanted to shout, to scream the truth. He wanted to tell the world he was innocent. But the words caught in his throat as they always did, drowned by the weight of hopelessness. His mother, Evelyn Carter, sat at the back of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tears streaked her face, her lips moving in silent prayer. Brandon glanced at her, feeling the sting of guilt not for something he had done, but for the pain she had to endure. The judge's voice continued, unwavering. "I sentence you to 60 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 20 years. The gavel came down with a decisive crack, and the sound echoed through the room, final and absolute. Evelyn let out a muffled sob, her head bowing as if under the weight of those words. Brandon felt his heart sink. He turned to look at his mother one last time, as officers moved to escort him away. Her trembling lips formed the words, "I love you," but her voice was drowned out by the commotion of the courtroom. As Brandon shuffled down the long, sterile hallway toward the holding cells, the reality of his situation bore down on him. The evidence had been overwhelming: fingerprints on the weapon, eyewitnesses who swore they recognized his voice, surveillance footage showing someone with his build. But Brandon knew he had not committed the crime. He had been working a double shift at the auto repair shop that day, but his alibi had crumbled under cross-examination when his boss admitted he could not verify Brandon's exact whereabouts. Brandon's life before his arrest had been simple. He worked long hours as a mechanic, often getting his hands dirty, fixing old engines while dreaming of saving enough to start his own garage. He lived with his mother in a small 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Sacramento. It was not much, but it was home. His room, cluttered with car magazines and model engines, reflected his passion for building and repairing. He had always prided himself on being a hard worker, someone who stayed out of trouble. Now, as he sat alone in the back of the transport van, headed for Folsom State Prison, Those dreams felt like distant memories. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the cold steel wall. The rhythmic hum of the engine reminded him of better days, but the growing lump in his throat kept those thoughts at bay. The prison loomed in the distance, its gray walls rising like a fortress. Razor wire glinted in the sunlight, and guard towers stood sentinel at every corner. Inside, the noise was overwhelming shouts, clanging metal, and the ever-present buzz of fluorescent lights. Brandon was processed quickly, stripped of his belongings, and handed a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The heavy door to his cell clanged shut behind him, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely and utterly powerless. That first night, as Brandon lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, despair began to creep in. He thought of his mother, how she must be feeling, alone in their little house, grappling with the unfairness of it all. He thought of the jewelry store clerk, Tom Gaines, who had been shot during the robbery. Brandon had never met the man, but he could not shake the image of his pain. Someone had to pay, and the system had chosen him. The days that followed blurred into one another. Breakfast trays of watery oatmeal and stale bread were delivered at dawn, followed by hours of confinement. The other inmates eyed him, sizing him up. Brandon knew better than to make eye contact or speak out of turn. He kept his head down and focused on surviving. But survival was not easy. On his third day, a group of inmates cornered him in the yard. They accused him of taking up too much space on the bench press, shoving him hard against the concrete wall. Before he could react, another inmate stepped in, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a calm demeanor. "Leave the kid alone," the man said firmly. His voice carried authority, and the group backed off with a few muttered curses. Later, the man approached Brandon in the cafeteria. "Name's Sam," he said, extending a hand. "You looked like you could use a friend." Brandon hesitated, then shook his hand. Sam's kindness was unexpected, and it caught Brandon off guard. Over the next few weeks, Sam showed him the unspoken rules of prison life, who to avoid, how to stay under the radar, and how to maintain a sense of self in a place designed to strip you of it. Sam's guidance gave Brandon a glimmer of hope, but it was not enough to erase the bitterness he felt. Every time he replayed the trial in his mind, he could not shake the feeling that the evidence had been too neat, too perfect. Someone had framed him, and he had no way to prove it. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson sat in his office late one evening, sifting through case files for a new investigation into police misconduct. He came across a name, Brandon Carter, and a list of evidence from another robbery that had taken place around the same time. Something about the overlap did not sit right with him. He stared at the documents, his brow furrowing. As the night deepened, Grayson set the file aside with a sigh. He could not ignore the flicker of unease in his chest. It was the same feeling he had the day he sentenced Brandon. But fatigue won out, and he told himself it was probably nothing. In his cell that night, Brandon sat on the edge of his cot, holding a letter from his mother. Her words were full of love and encouragement, but they brought him no comfort. He looked out the small, barred window at the moon, its light a reminder of the world he had left behind. Unbeknownst to Brandon, the seeds of change had already been sown. Judge Grayson's growing doubts, Sam's unexpected kindness, and his mother's unwavering belief in his innocence were small ripples in a vast ocean. But those ripples were beginning to build into a wave, one that would soon alter the course of Brandon's life forever. As the night stretched on, Brandon whispered a quiet vow to himself. "I will survive this," he said softly, "and I will prove the truth." The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sliver of resolve. The first week in prison tested every ounce of Brandon's resilience. The cold, unwelcoming walls of Folsom State Prison bore down on him with relentless indifference. Every day felt like an uphill battle, a constant effort to navigate a world governed by unwritten rules and silent threats. Yet, despite the suffocating environment, Brandon found an unexpected lifeline in Sam Henson. Sam was unlike anyone Brandon had ever met. In his mid-50s, with a grizzled beard and a no-nonsense attitude, Sam carried himself with a quiet authority. He had been in and out of the system for most of his life, yet there was a sense of calm about him, as if he had made peace with his circumstances. "You gotta keep your head straight in here," Sam said one afternoon, as they sat in the corner of the yard, away from prying eyes. "It's easy to lose yourself, to forget who you are. Don't let this place do that to you." Brandon nodded, though his grip on his identity felt tenuous at best. He was trying, but the constant noise and unrelenting pressure to stay on guard left little room for introspection. Still, he listened to Sam. It was clear that the older man had seen it all, and Brandon figured there was wisdom in his words. In the evenings, when the prison settled into a restless quiet, Brandon often thought about what had led him here. The trial played in his mind like a broken record. The damning evidence, the prosecution's sharp words, the way his own lawyer had faltered under pressure. But what haunted him most was the feeling that he had been deliberately placed in the crosshairs. One evening, while lying on his cot, Brandon decided to write a letter to Judge Grayson. He had nothing to lose, and even the smallest chance that the judge might reconsider his case was worth the effort. The letter was simple, just a few paragraphs explaining his alibi and asking for another look at the evidence. He folded the paper neatly and tucked it into an envelope, addressing it to the courthouse. The next morning, during mail call, he handed it to the guard with trembling hands. It felt like a long shot, but it was something a step toward reclaiming his voice. Meanwhile, Judge Walter Grayson sat in his wood-paneled office, illuminated by the dim glow of a desk lamp. The quiet hum of the city beyond the courthouse provided a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The case file he had stumbled upon earlier in the week sat open on his desk. It detailed an unrelated robbery that had occurred just days after the one Brandon had been convicted for. At first glance, it seemed inconsequential, but one item stood out: a gun matching the description of the weapon used in Brandon's case. The problem? This gun had been logged into evidence 2 days after the robbery Brandon supposedly committed. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he contemplated the implications. If this gun had been in police custody, it could not have been used in the crime. He scribbled a note to himself to cross-reference the serial number with Brandon's trial records. The seed of doubt that had taken root during sentencing began to grow, and Grayson found himself questioning the very system he had devoted his life to. The next day, Brandon received a rare piece of good news. He had been assigned to work in the prison library, a small reprieve from the monotony of his cell. The library was a modest room filled with battered books and outdated magazines, but it offered a quiet escape. It was there that he met Clara Morris, a volunteer librarian who visited the prison twice a week. In her early 40s, Clara was a warm, unassuming woman with a passion for helping others. She had a way of making people feel seen, even in a place where invisibility was often a survival tactic. During her first shift with Brandon, Clara noticed the guarded way he carried himself. She watched as he sorted through a stack of books, his movements careful and deliberate. "You're doing a great job," she said with a smile. Brandon glanced up, startled. Compliments were rare in prison, and he was not sure how to respond. Thanks," he mumbled, returning to his task. Over the weeks, Clara tried to engage with Brandon, asking about his interests and offering book recommendations. At first, he was hesitant, unsure of her intentions. But as their conversations grew, he found himself opening up. One afternoon, while reshelving books together, Brandon finally shared a piece of his story. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the rows of paperbacks. "I didn't do what they said I did." Clara paused, sensing the weight of his words. "I believe you," she said simply. Her response caught Brandon off guard. It was not pity or skepticism, just a quiet affirmation that made him feel, for the first time in months, that someone was on his side. Meanwhile, Grayson had begun his own quiet investigation. He enlisted the help of an old friend, retired Detective Michael Langston, to dig into the evidence from Brandon's trial. Langston was known for his meticulous nature and unshakable sense of justice. "I'll look into it," Langston said when Grayson explained his suspicions. "But if there's something to find, you better be prepared for what it might mean." Grayson nodded, though he was not sure he was ready for the answers. The more he delved into the case, the more he realized how fragile the truth could be. Back in the library, Clara handed Brandon a book she thought he might like, a collection of stories about resilience and survival. "This one's for you," she said, her smile encouraging. Brandon took the book, running his fingers over the worn cover. "Thanks," he said, his voice tinged with something new gratitude. As the weeks passed, Clara's kindness began to chip away at the walls Brandon had built around himself. She saw him not as a case number, but as a young man trying to hold on to hope in impossible circumstances. Her belief in his potential reignited a spark within him, a reminder that his story was not over. Unbeknownst to Brandon, his letter had reached Grayson's desk. The judge read it late one night, the raw emotion in Brandon's words striking a chord. It was a plea not just for justice, but for humanity. Grayson set the letter down and stared out the window at the city lights. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain. He could no longer ignore the questions swirling in his mind. In the stillness of his cell, Brandon opened the book Clara had given him. As he turned the pages, he felt a quiet determination take root. He was not alone in his fight, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that the truth might yet prevail. The ripples of kindness, Sam's guidance, Clara's encouragement, and Grayson's growing doubts were beginning to converge. And though the road ahead was fraught with challenges, the tide was slowly starting to turn. The library became Brandon's refuge. Its quiet atmosphere stood in stark contrast to the chaos of prison life, giving him space to think and, at times, to dream. Clara continued to bring new books each week, carefully chosen for their themes of resilience, justice, and hope. Brandon found himself devouring them late into the night, their words echoing in his mind long after the lights went out. "You've got a sharp mind," Clara told him one day, as she watched him finish a puzzle she had brought to keep the inmates occupied. "You could do something great with it." Brandon paused, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Maybe in another life," he said, but her words lingered. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson's unease grew. The letter Brandon had written sat on his desk, its contents replaying in his mind. He could not shake the sincerity of Brandon's words, nor could he ignore the anomalies in the evidence he had uncovered. Grayson spent hours poring over documents, his once solid faith in the system beginning to waver. The key piece was the gun from the unrelated robbery. Grayson had confirmed the serial number matched the weapon supposedly used in the crime Brandon had been convicted for. Yet, according to the evidence log, this gun had been in police custody at the time of the robbery. It was a detail too glaring to overlook, and Grayson knew he needed help. He called Michael Langston, the retired detective, for an update. "Mike, tell me I'm not crazy," Grayson said, his voice heavy with frustration. "You're not crazy, Walter," Langston replied, "but you've got a mess on your hands. I've been digging, and it looks like some of the evidence was either fabricated or misplaced intentionally. I'd bet my pension this wasn't an accident." Grayson's chest tightened. The implications were staggering. A man's life had been stolen, and the system he had devoted his life to upholding had played a role. "What do we do?" Grayson asked. Langston's tone was firm. "We find the truth." Back at the prison, Brandon's routine was interrupted by a rare moment of levity. Sam had found an old chess set in the rec room and invited Brandon to play. They sat at a battered table near the edge of the yard, the clink of chess pieces punctuating the distant chatter of other inmates. "You ever play?" Sam asked as he set up the board. "A little," Brandon replied. My dad taught me when I was a kid. Sam raised an eyebrow. Then you've got no excuse to lose. As the game progressed, Brandon found himself relaxing in a way he had not since his arrival. Sam's easygoing demeanor was infectious, and for a brief moment, the weight of his circumstances felt lighter. "You're getting better at this," Sam said, as Brandon captured his rook. Brandon shrugged. "I had a good teacher." Sam leaned back, studying the young man in front of him. "You know, kid, you've got something most people in here don't." "What's that?" "Hope. Don't let this place take that from you." The words hit Brandon like a bolt of lightning. Hope. It was a fragile thing, one he had buried deep beneath layers of anger and despair. Yet, between Sam's mentorship and Clara's encouragement, it was beginning to resurface. Meanwhile, Clara had not stopped thinking about Brandon's case. His story haunted her, and she found herself combing through old newspaper articles in her spare time, searching for anything that might lend credibility to his claims. One day, she came across a small detail in a local news archive, a mention of a traffic stop that had led to the recovery of a stolen gun. The date and description matched the weapon in Brandon's case. Clara's heart raced as she printed the article. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was something. She resolved to bring it to Brandon the next time she visited. When she arrived at the library that week, Brandon was shelving books. She handed him the printout with a quiet urgency. "I found this," she said. "I don't know if it helps, but it's worth looking into." Brandon read the article, his eyes narrowing. "This is the gun they said I used," he muttered. "But if it was recovered after the robbery—" Clara nodded. "Then it couldn't have been used in the crime." Brandon felt a surge of determination. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "This means more than you know." That night, Brandon sat on his cot, the article spread out before him. It was a glimmer of proof, a thread he could pull on to unravel the lie that had stolen his freedom. He wrote another letter, this time to Clara, thanking her for her belief in him. It was a simple gesture, but it marked the beginning of a friendship built on trust and shared purpose. At the same time, Grayson and Langston were making headway. Langston had tracked down one of the witnesses from Brandon's trial, a store clerk named Henry Vargas. Initially, Vargas had identified another man as the suspect, but he had changed his statement after meeting with Detective Scott Lewis, the lead investigator. Langston met Vargas at a small diner on the edge of town. The man was nervous, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "I didn't want to do it," Vargas said, "but Lewis pressured me. He said if I didn't cooperate, I'd be in trouble." Langston's jaw tightened. "Did he tell you to identify Brandon Carter?" Vargas nodded. "He gave me a photo and said, 'This is the guy.' I was scared. I didn't want to lie, but—" His voice trailed off, and Langston placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing now," he said. "We'll make sure the truth comes out." Grayson felt a mix of relief and anger when Langston shared the news. The pieces were falling into place, but the scale of the corruption was staggering. He knew they needed more evidence to bring the case back to court, but the clock was ticking. Back in the prison library, Clara watched as Brandon interacted with the other inmates. He had started recommending books to them, sharing the same encouragement she had shown him. She smiled, realizing that despite everything, Brandon's spirit was unbroken. "You're making a difference," she told him one day. Brandon looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "So are you." The words hung between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the power of kindness in even the darkest places. As the days turned into weeks, the ripples of change grew stronger. Clara's discovery, Langston's investigation, and Grayson's growing determination were converging into a force that could not be ignored. Brandon, for his part, felt a flicker of something he had almost forgotten: hope. The fight for truth was just beginning, but for the first time, it felt like a fight he could win. The prison library felt quieter than usual, the faint sound of rustling pages punctuated by the occasional cough from an inmate browsing the shelves. Brandon worked steadily, his thoughts turning over Clara's discovery. The article she had found about the recovered gun lingered in his mind, a thread of truth in the tangled web of lies that had put him behind bars. He didn't know what would come of it, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a glimmer of light piercing through the darkness. Clara watched Brandon carefully as he worked. Over the weeks, she had noticed a change in him. He still carried the weight of his circumstances, but there was a new determination in his eyes, a quiet defiance against the forces that had wronged him. "You seem more focused," she remarked, handing him a stack of books to organize. Brandon offered a faint smile. "I guess I've got something to work toward now." Clara nodded, her heart lifting at his words. She had always believed that hope, even in its smallest form, could be transformative. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson was delving deeper into Brandon's case, his evenings consumed by a growing pile of files and reports. Langston's discovery about Henry Vargas had been a critical piece, but Grayson knew they needed more to challenge the original verdict. He combed through the trial transcripts and police logs, searching for anything that might bolster their case. One night, as he sifted through the evidence list, something caught his eye. The surveillance footage from the jewelry store, which had been a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument, had been submitted without a proper chain of custody. Grayson frowned, his instincts kicking in. He reached for his phone and dialed Langston. "Mike, I need you to look into the surveillance footage from Carter's case. Something about it doesn't add up." Langston agreed, and the next day he dug into the records. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The footage had been provided by Detective Scott Lewis, the same officer whose name was now cropping up repeatedly in connection to questionable practices. Langston decided to pay Lewis a visit. He arrived at the detective's suburban home unannounced, the sound of his knock echoing in the still afternoon air. When Lewis opened the door, his expression hardened instantly. "What do you want, Langston?" he asked, his tone clipped. Langston didn't flinch. "I'm looking into the Carter case. Thought you might have some answers." Lewis crossed his arms, his posture defensive. "That case was open and shut. If you're digging around, you're wasting your time." "Maybe," Langston replied evenly, "but I've got a feeling there's more to it than what's on paper." Lewis's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. As Langston walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lewis was hiding something. Back in prison, Brandon found solace in the small acts of kindness that had become part of his daily routine. Sam continued to guide him, offering advice and encouragement during their chess games in the yard. "You've got to keep your mind sharp," Sam said one afternoon, moving his knight into position. "The system might try to break you, but they can't take what's in here." He tapped his temple for emphasis. Brandon nodded, absorbing the words. He had come to respect Sam's perspective, shaped by years of navigating the justice system's harsh realities. At the same time, Clara was quietly building a network of allies. She reached out to Sarah Turner, a local journalist known for her investigative reporting. Clara shared Brandon's story, providing the details she had uncovered about the gun and the questionable police practices involved in the case. Sarah was intrigued. "This sounds like more than just a bad conviction," she said. "It sounds like a cover-up." Clara hesitated. "Do you think you can help?" Sarah nodded. "I'll see what I can dig up." Sarah's investigation led her to a series of internal memos from the police department, leaked by a source who wished to remain anonymous. The memos revealed that Lewis had a history of manipulating evidence to secure convictions. It was a bombshell discovery, one that added weight to the mounting evidence of Brandon's innocence. Judge Grayson, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the pressure. His colleagues at the courthouse had started to notice his growing preoccupation with the case. Some questioned his judgment, while others warned him to tread carefully. "You're opening a can of worms, Walter," one judge said over lunch. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Grayson set down his coffee cup, his expression resolute. "If I don't, who will?" his resolve only strengthened when Langston shared his latest finding. A forensic analysis of the surveillance footage revealed that it had been edited, key timestamps had been altered, and portions of the video were missing. Grayson felt a surge of anger. "This isn't just negligence," he said. "This is deliberate." Langston nodded. "We've got enough to file a motion to reopen the case." The next morning, Grayson sat in his chambers, drafting the motion. His pen moved steadily across the paper, each word a step closer to justice. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. In the library that day, Brandon received a surprise. Clara handed him a neatly folded newspaper, the headline catching his eye. "Local judge files motion to reopen conviction." Brandon's heart pounded as he read the article. It described Grayson's motion, citing new evidence and allegations of misconduct in the original investigation. For the first time in years, he felt a sliver of hope break through the despair. "You did this," Brandon said, looking at Clara. "You believed in me." Clara shook her head, her smile warm. "You deserve the truth, Brandon, and we're going to fight for it." The momentum was building. Grayson's motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse, while Sarah Turner's investigative piece began to draw public attention. The walls that had once seemed impenetrable were starting to crack. As Brandon returned to his cell that evening, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: gratitude. The kindness of strangers, from Clara's unwavering support to Grayson's growing determination, was changing the course of his life. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Brandon allowed himself to believe that the truth would prevail. The weight of the newspaper article lingered with Brandon long after Clara had left the library. Back in his cell, he read and reread the words, feeling a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. Judge Grayson had filed a motion to reopen his case. The very man who had sentenced him now seemed to believe there was a chance he might be innocent. The thought was almost too much to process. Across town, Judge Grayson sat in his office, preparing for the inevitable fallout from his decision. The motion to reopen Brandon's case had already sparked murmurs among his colleagues, some supportive, others skeptical. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but the mounting evidence of corruption left him no choice. Grayson's wife, Margaret, found him late that evening, poring over files with a furrowed brow. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "You're doing the right thing, Walter." He nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. "I just hope it's enough." The next day, the prison hummed with a strange energy as news of Brandon's potential retrial spread among the inmates. Brandon walked cautiously through the yard, aware of the new attention on him. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with resentment. Not everyone welcomed the idea of someone escaping the system, especially when so many had resigned themselves to its grip. It was during this uneasy moment that Brandon crossed paths with Paul Reynolds, a wiry man in his early 40s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. Paul was a former inmate-turned-mentor who had returned to the prison as part of a program to help those serving time. His focus was on guiding younger men away from cycles of violence and despair. Paul had heard about Brandon's story through Clara and was intrigued by the young man's resolve. He approached Brandon near the basketball court, his voice steady but kind. "I hear you've got a shot at getting out," Paul said, leaning casually against the chain-link fence. Brandon glanced at him warily. "Maybe. It's not certain yet." Paul nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's more than most of us get. What are you planning to do with it?" The question caught Brandon off guard. He had been so consumed with surviving day to day that he hadn't allowed himself to think beyond the walls of the prison. He shrugged, his voice low. "I don't know yet." Paul smiled faintly. "Well, if you're willing to listen, I've got some ideas." Over the weeks that followed, Paul became another unexpected ally. He introduced Brandon to the prison's literacy program, encouraging him to help others learn to read and write. At first, Brandon was hesitant. He didn't see himself as a teacher, but Paul's quiet insistence wore down his defenses. "Think of it this way," Paul said one day. "Every person you help is one less person who feels forgotten. It's a way to fight back against the system, even if it's just a little." Brandon took the challenge seriously, spending his evenings in the library with a small group of inmates. Teaching them wasn't easy. Patience had never been his strong suit, but he found a strange satisfaction in watching others succeed. Clara noticed the change in him during her weekly visits. She watched as he interacted with the other inmates, his confidence growing with each lesson he taught. "You're making a difference," she told him one day, her smile warm. Brandon shrugged, though a hint of pride flickered in his eyes. "I'm just trying to keep busy." But it was more than that, and both of them knew it. Meanwhile, Sarah Turner's investigative reporting continued to gain traction. Her articles painted a damning picture of Detective Scott Lewis, whose history of coercion and fabrication was coming to light. Public pressure mounted as more witnesses came forward, including Henry Vargas, the store clerk who had been forced to change his testimony. Sarah tracked down Brandon's former boss, who admitted that his uncertainty during the trial had stemmed from police pressure to avoid providing a solid alibi. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the narrative of Brandon's guilt was unraveling. Judge Grayson used the growing public interest to push for expedited hearings. His position on the bench gave him enough leverage to navigate the bureaucracy, but it came at a cost. Anonymous threats began to appear in his mailbox, warning him to abandon the case. His colleagues grew distant, some questioning his motives. At home, Margaret remained his anchor. She listened patiently as he vented his frustrations, offering quiet support. "This isn't just about Brandon," Grayson said one night, his voice heavy. "It's about the entire system. If this can happen to him, how many others are suffering the same fate?" Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Then you have to keep going. For all of them." Back in prison, Brandon's small victories were met with growing hostility from some inmates who viewed his potential release as a threat. One evening in the yard, tensions boiled over. A group of men cornered him near the weight benches, their faces hard with resentment. "You think you're better than us?" one of them sneered. Before Brandon could respond, Sam appeared, his presence alone enough to diffuse the situation. He stepped between Brandon and the others, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away," Sam said, locking eyes with the leader of the group. After a tense moment, they relented, muttering curses under their breath as they left. Brandon exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. "Thanks," he said quietly. Sam clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let them get to you, kid. You've got more to fight for than they do." As Brandon lay on his cot that night, his thoughts turned to the people who had supported him: Clara, Paul, Sam, even Judge Grayson. Their kindness had carried him through the darkest moments, and he realized he had a responsibility to honor their faith in him. The next morning, he approached Paul with a new resolve. "I want to do more," Brandon said. "Whatever it takes, I want to make this time count." Paul smiled, sensing the shift in him. "Good. Let's get to work." The ripple of change was growing stronger, spreading beyond the prison walls. Grayson's motion was scheduled for a preliminary hearing, and the evidence Sarah and Langston had uncovered promised to make waves in the courtroom. For Brandon, the fight was far from over, but he felt something he hadn't in years: a sense of purpose. The truth was within reach, and he was determined to seize it. As the sun set over the prison yard, Brandon stood at the window of his cell, staring out at the fading light. The storm was far from over, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it head-on. The hearing date for Judge Grayson's motion to reopen Brandon's case loomed like a distant storm cloud. In the weeks leading up to it, tensions built both inside and outside the prison walls. Brandon felt the weight of anticipation, a mixture of hope and fear that left him restless at night. In the library, Clara continued her weekly visits. offering encouragement and small updates about the case. Her presence was a steadying force in Brandon's chaotic reality, but even she could sense the growing unease around them. "People are starting to pay attention," Clara said one afternoon, sliding a newspaper across the table to Brandon. The front page featured Sarah Turner's latest exposé on systemic corruption within the police department, with Detective Scott Lewis's name in bold letters. Brandon's eyes scanned the article, his hands tightening on the edges of the paper. "They're really doing it," he murmured. Clara smiled, though her expression was tinged with caution. "Yes, but this kind of exposure doesn't come without risks. Be careful, Brandon." Her warning echoed in his mind later that day when he noticed the subtle shifts in the prison's atmosphere. Guards watched him more closely, their gazes sharper, less indifferent. Some inmates who had previously ignored him now eyed him with a mix of curiosity and hostility. Brandon did his best to keep his head down, but the growing scrutiny was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson faced his own set of challenges. His motion had sent ripples through the courthouse, drawing both support and criticism. Some colleagues praised his courage, while others questioned his loyalty to the system. One evening, as Grayson prepared for the upcoming hearing, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It read simply, "Drop the case, or there will be consequences." Grayson stared at the screen, his stomach knotting. He had received veiled threats before, but this felt different, more personal. He showed the message to Margaret, who read it with a calm determination. "You knew this wouldn't be easy," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But you're doing the right thing." Grayson nodded, though the weight of the decision pressed heavily on him. "I just hope it's worth it." The backlash extended beyond Grayson. Sarah Turner, whose investigative reporting had brought the case into the public eye, began receiving anonymous emails accusing her of bias and sensationalism. Undeterred, she continued to dig deeper, uncovering additional evidence of misconduct tied to Lewis and his allies within the department. "This is bigger than Brandon's case," Sarah told Clara during a phone call. "It's a whole network of corruption. If we can prove it, we might not just free Brandon, we might expose the rot in the entire system." Clara's heart swelled with hope, but she knew the fight was far from over. "Just be careful," she urged. "These people won't go down without a fight." Within the prison, Brandon found himself caught between admiration and resentment. Some inmates respected his determination and viewed his potential retrial as a glimmer of hope for others who had been wrongfully convicted. But others saw it as a threat, a reminder that escape from the system was possible for some, but not for all. One evening, as Brandon returned to his cell from the library, he was confronted by two inmates blocking the narrow hallway. "Think you're special, Carter?" one of them sneered, stepping closer. Brandon's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get through this, like everyone else." "Yeah?" the other man said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Well, some of us don't like the attention you're bringing." Before the situation could escalate, a guard appeared, his presence enough to send the men scattering. Brandon exhaled, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped into his cell. The confrontation was a stark reminder of the precariousness of his position. The next day, Paul Reynolds pulled him aside during a break in the literacy program. "Word gets around fast in here," Paul said, his expression serious. "You've got to watch your back. Not everyone wants to see you succeed." Brandon nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, but I can't stop now." Paul's gaze softened. "Good. Just don't lose sight of who you are in the process." Brandon carried those words with him as the days passed, drawing strength from the small victories he had achieved. Teaching literacy to other inmates had become a source of purpose, a way to channel his frustration into something meaningful. He refused to let the negativity around him dim the hope that had begun to grow. Meanwhile, Grayson and Langston continued their work, piecing together the evidence that would support the motion. Langston had tracked down a former officer who had worked under Lewis and was willing to testify about the unethical practices he had witnessed. It was a risky move, but one that could strengthen their case. The night before the hearing, Grayson sat in his chambers, reviewing his notes. The weight of the responsibility he carried was almost overwhelming, but he reminded himself of why he had taken this path. In his cell, Brandon lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The hearing felt like a distant dream, something he could barely allow himself to believe in. Yet, he thought of Clara's unwavering support, Paul's mentorship, and Sam's steady presence. They had given him something he hadn't had in years: hope. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras trained on the building's entrance. Inside, Grayson stood at the podium, his voice firm as he presented the evidence. He spoke of the inconsistencies in the original investigation, the suppressed evidence, and the testimonies of witnesses who had been coerced. As he finished, a hush fell over the courtroom. The judge presiding over the hearing leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "This motion raises serious questions about the integrity of the original trial," the judge said. "I will take it under advisement and deliver my decision within the week." The hearing ended, but the fight was far from over. As Grayson exited the courthouse, he was met with a barrage of questions from reporters. He answered calmly, emphasizing the need for accountability within the justice system. Back in prison, Brandon waited anxiously for news, the hours dragging by with agonizing slowness. When Clara visited that afternoon, she brought a quiet sense of reassurance. "No matter what happens," she said, her voice steady, "you've come this far because of your strength. Don't forget that." Brandon nodded, his gratitude evident. "I won't." The storm was still raging, but for Brandon, the courage he had found in the kindness of others gave him the strength to weather it. And as the days stretched into weeks, he held on to the hope that the truth, once uncovered, could never be silenced. The week following the hearing was the longest of Brandon's life. Each day felt like an eternity as he waited for news of the judge's decision. The atmosphere in the prison shifted once again, a tense energy crackling through the corridors. Brandon could feel the stares, the whispers, the unspoken judgments from those who either envied or resented his position. Clara visited him in the library, bringing her usual warmth and a stack of new books. But today, her smile seemed tinged with worry. She had been following the case closely, aware of the stakes and the forces working against them. "Stay strong," she told Brandon as she handed him a worn paperback. "Whatever happens, remember that you have people fighting for you." Brandon nodded, his grip tightening on the book. "I'm trying," he said softly. "It's just hard not knowing." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "The truth has a way of coming out, even when it's buried deep. You just have to hold on." Meanwhile, Judge Grayson was navigating a firestorm. The fallout from the hearing had intensified, with anonymous threats becoming more frequent and his professional relationships growing strained. But he refused to back down. He spent every waking moment reviewing evidence, coordinating with Langston and Sarah Turner to strengthen their case. Langston had managed to uncover another critical piece of evidence: security camera footage from a parking lot near the jewelry store on the day of the robbery. The video showed a man with a duffel bag leaving the area, a man who matched Detective Scott Lewis's physical description. "This is it," Langston told Grayson as they reviewed the footage in his office. "This tie him directly to the crime." Grayson felt a surge of both relief and anger. Relief that the truth was finally within reach, and anger at the depths of corruption that had allowed Brandon to be convicted in the first place. "We need to get this to the court immediately," Grayson said, his voice firm. The next day, Grayson filed an emergency motion to submit the new evidence. The security footage, combined with the testimonies from coerced witnesses and the inconsistencies in the original investigation, painted a damning picture of Detective Lewis's actions. News of the motion spread quickly, and the media descended on the courthouse. Sarah Turner's latest article, which detailed the new evidence, further fueled public outrage. The pressure on the justice system to act was mounting. In prison, Brandon felt the weight of the moment, even though he had yet to hear the specifics. Paul pulled him aside during a break in the literacy program, his expression serious but encouraging. "You're close, kid," Paul said. "Don't let the waiting break you. You've already come this far." Brandon nodded, though the anxiety gnawed at him. "I just want to know what's next," he admitted. Paul smiled faintly. "Whatever it is, you'll handle it. You're stronger than you think." The following morning, a guard arrived at Brandon's cell with an announcement. "Carter, you've got a visitor," the guard said, his tone unreadable. Brandon's heart pounded as he was led to the visitation room. To his surprise, it was not Clara or his mother waiting for him, but Sarah Turner. She sat across the table, a notebook in front of her and a determined look in her eyes. "Brandon," she began, her voice steady, "I wanted to meet you in person. I've been writing about your case, and I want you to know that people are listening. The truth is coming out." Brandon studied her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. Sarah's expression softened. "Because what happened to you isn't just a mistake, it's an injustice. And if we can expose it, maybe we can prevent it from happening to someone else." Her words resonated deeply with Brandon. For so long, he had felt like a forgotten cog in a broken machine. But now, for the first time, he saw himself as part of something bigger. "Thank you," he said quietly. Later that day, the news Brandon had been waiting for arrived. The judge presiding over the case had granted a new hearing based on the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Brandon's conviction would be re-examined, and he would have the chance to prove his innocence. The announcement sent shockwaves through the prison. Some inmates congratulated Brandon, offering handshakes and nods of respect. Others remained aloof, their resentment simmering beneath the surface. That evening, Sam found Brandon in the library, sorting through a stack of books. "Looks like you're getting your shot," Sam said, a rare smile breaking across his weathered face. Brandon nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "I just hope it's enough." Sam clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You've done the hard part already. Now it's up to them to do what's right." Meanwhile, Detective Scott Lewis was feeling the pressure. The walls were closing in, and his once unassailable position was crumbling. Through his lawyer, he issued a public statement denying the allegations, claiming he was the victim of a smear campaign. But the evidence against him was too strong to ignore. The parking lot footage, combined with the testimonies of coerced witnesses and the discovery of falsified reports, left little room for doubt. In the days leading up to the retrial, Brandon prepared himself mentally and emotionally. Paul and Clara offered constant support, while Grayson and Langston worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was accounted for. When the day of the retrial finally arrived, Brandon was led into the courtroom in shackles, but he held his head high. The room was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the community who had followed his story. Judge Grayson sat quietly in the back, watching as the proceedings began. He felt a mixture of pride and nervousness, knowing that the outcome of this case could have far-reaching implications. As the evidence was presented, the truth of Brandon's innocence became undeniable. The falsified reports, the coerced testimonies, and the security footage all pointed to a conspiracy to frame him for a crime he did not commit. When the judge announced the decision to overturn Brandon's conviction, the courtroom erupted in applause. Brandon sat frozen for a moment, the weight of the moment crashing over him. "You're free," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him tightly. Brandon walked out of the courthouse that day, a free man, but he knew his journey was far from over. The fight for justice had changed him, and he was determined to use his experience to help others. As he stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by supporters, Brandon looked out at the sea of faces and felt a sense of purpose he had never known. The chains had been broken, and now it was time to build something new. Brandon's first steps outside the courthouse were surreal. The sun felt brighter, the air lighter, and yet he remained weighted by the years he had lost. A crowd of reporters gathered at the bottom of the courthouse steps, their cameras and microphones pointed at him. Clara, Paul, and Sarah flanked him, each offering quiet support as he faced the barrage of questions. "How does it feel to be free, Mr. Carter? Do you have any words for Detective Lewis or the Fresno Police Department? What are your plans now?" Brandon hesitated, the noise overwhelming. Then he raised his hand, signaling for silence. The reporters quieted, their eyes trained on him. "I spent 5 years in a place I didn't belong," Brandon said, his voice steady. "But I'm not the only one. There are others who have been wrongfully convicted, others whose voices haven't been heard. My fight doesn't end here. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." His words carried a weight that stilled the crowd. Clara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, pride shining in her eyes. As the group made their way to the parking lot, Brandon noticed his mother waiting by the car, her face streaked with tears. Evelyn Carter, who had fought tirelessly for her son, pulled him into a fierce embrace the moment he reached her. "You're home," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're finally home." For the first time in years, Brandon felt the warmth of her love unclouded by bars and barriers. Back in his small 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Sacramento, Brandon's return was both familiar and foreign. His room was exactly as he had left it. Model engines still cluttered the shelves, car magazines stacked in a corner. But the man standing in that room was no longer the same. The first few nights were restless. The silence felt deafening, and every creak of the house jolted him awake. But Evelyn's presence was a comfort, her quiet strength grounding him as he adjusted to life outside. The media frenzy surrounding Brandon's release continued to build. Sarah Turner's articles had not only exposed Detective Lewis's corruption, but also triggered a deeper investigation into the Fresno Police Department. The Department of Justice announced it would be conducting a federal probe, and Lewis was formally charged with multiple counts of misconduct, perjury, and obstruction of justice. For Judge Grayson, the fallout was bittersweet. His decision to pursue Brandon's case had garnered public praise, but also alienated him from some colleagues. Still, the calls for systemic reform were louder than ever, and Grayson knew his actions had sparked a necessary reckoning. Brandon wasted no time in taking the next step in his journey. With Paul's help, he joined a local advocacy group dedicated to helping the wrongfully convicted. The group, led by Paul and other former inmates, focused on providing legal aid, mentorship, and support to those still fighting for justice. On his first day at the office, a modest space filled with mismatched furniture and stacks of case files, Brandon felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. "You've got a story that people will listen to," Paul told him as they sorted through letters from inmates seeking help. "Use it." Brandon nodded, his determination growing. "I will." One afternoon, Clara visited the office, bringing coffee and a stack of books for the mentorship program. "How's he doing?" she asked Paul, as they watched Brandon help a young man draft a letter to his attorney. Paul smiled. "He's a natural. He's taking what he's been through and turning it into something good." Clara nodded, her heart swelling with pride. Watching Brandon grow into his new role was a reminder of the power of resilience and the impact of small acts of kindness. While Brandon found his footing, the investigation into the Fresno Police Department uncovered a web of corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Dozens of cases were reviewed, and several convictions were overturned as evidence of misconduct surfaced. Sarah Turner's relentless reporting brought national attention to the case, and she often reached out to Brandon for insight and perspective. Their partnership grew, with Brandon offering a first-hand account of his experiences to amplify the movement for reform. One evening, as they prepared for a community forum, Sarah turned to Brandon. "Have you thought about speaking publicly?" she asked. Brandon hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You've already been through the hardest part," Sarah said gently. "Your voice can make a difference." Brandon thought about her words that night, turning them over in his mind. He had spent so long trying to prove his innocence that the idea of stepping into the spotlight felt daunting. But he also knew she was right. His story could help others. A few weeks later, Brandon stood before a packed auditorium at a justice reform rally. The audience included activists, lawyers, families of the wrongfully convicted, and everyday people who had been moved by his story. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. Then he began to speak. "I was just a mechanic, living a quiet life when everything was taken from me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I spent years behind bars for something I didn't do. I thought I was forgotten, but I wasn't. People believed in me. People I didn't even know. Their kindness saved me. And now, I want to be that person for someone else." The room erupted in applause, but Brandon remained grounded. This wasn't about recognition. It was about change. As the months passed, Brandon's work continued to grow. He traveled to speak at universities, community centers, and legal conferences, sharing his story and advocating for reforms to prevent wrongful convictions. Each step was a reminder of the kindness and resilience that had brought him this far. Judge Grayson retired later that year, but remained active in the movement, often appearing alongside Brandon at events. Their unlikely alliance had become a symbol of hope, a testament to the idea that justice, though flawed, could still be pursued. Clara, now a close friend, continued her volunteer work, using her experience with Brandon's case to inspire others, and Sarah's reporting led to several policy changes, including new oversight measures for evidence handling and witness protection. One quiet evening, Brandon visited the grave of Tom Gaines, the jewelry store clerk who had been injured during the robbery. He placed a bouquet of flowers on the headstone and stood silently for a moment. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," he said softly, "but I promise I'll keep fighting to make sure no one else goes through what we did." As he walked away, the moonlight illuminated his path, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a way forward. Brandon's journey, shaped by resilience and the kindness of strangers, became a beacon of hope for others. His story proved that even in the face of injustice, the human spirit could persevere, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could spark the greatest change. Brandon stood in front of the mirror in his modest apartment, adjusting the tie Clara had given him as a gift. The fabric felt stiff under his fingers, unfamiliar, but he welcomed the discomfort. It reminded him of how far he had come. The rally tonight was his largest yet, held in the heart of Sacramento, and the room would be filled with hundreds of advocates, students, and officials. The past few months had been transformative. His schedule was packed with meetings, mentorship programs, and speaking engagements, yet he remained grounded by the memory of the years stolen from him. Those years, though filled with pain, had also shaped him into the man who now stood here, ready to speak for others still trapped in the system. Paul arrived to pick him up, leaning against the doorframe with an approving smile. "You clean up nice, Carter," he said. Brandon chuckled. "Don't get used to it. I'm more comfortable in grease-stained overalls." As they drove to the venue, Paul offered quiet advice, his words a steadying presence. "Remember, tonight's about them, the ones who need their voices heard. You're their hope." The words echoed in Brandon's mind as he stepped onto the stage later that evening. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy both exhilarating and intimidating. Brandon scanned the faces, finding Clara and Sarah in the front row, their expressions filled with pride. Judge Grayson sat beside them, his hands folded in his lap, his presence a quiet reminder of the power of accountability. Brandon began his speech with a story his story. He spoke of the quiet life he had led before his arrest, the despair of his trial, and the years he had spent behind bars. But he didn't dwell on the pain. Instead, he focused on the moments of kindness that had carried him through. Sam's mentorship, Clara's belief in him, Paul's guidance, and Grayson's courage to act. "I didn't survive on my own," he said, his voice steady. "I'm standing here because of the kindness of people who chose to see me, to believe in me when I felt invisible. And now, it's my turn to pass that on." The room erupted into applause, but Brandon felt no need to bask in it. This wasn't about him. It was about the movement he had become part of. The next morning, Brandon returned to the advocacy group's office, eager to dive back into the work that had become his purpose. The space buzzed with activity as volunteers sorted case files and answered phone calls. Paul approached him with a folder in hand. "Got another case I think you'll want to look at," Paul said, placing the folder on the desk. Brandon opened it, scanning the details of a young man named Javier Lopez, who had been convicted of armed robbery under circumstances eerily similar to his own. The evidence was shaky, and the conviction relied heavily on the testimony of a single witness who later recanted. Brandon felt a familiar pang of anger and determination. "Let's get to work," he said. While Brandon and Paul delved into Javier's case, the federal investigation into the Fresno Police Department reached its conclusion. The Department of Justice released a scathing report detailing systemic corruption, including fabricated evidence, coerced confessions, and a pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals. Detective Scott Lewis was sentenced to prison, his actions now serving as a stark warning to others who might exploit their positions of power. The fallout extended beyond the department. Policies were implemented to increase transparency and accountability, including mandatory body cameras for officers and stricter oversight of evidence handling. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Judge Grayson watched the reforms unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. His role in exposing the corruption had come at a personal cost, but he knew it had been worth it. He continued to work quietly behind the scenes, offering advice and support to those fighting for change. Brandon's work with Javier's case brought back memories of his own trial. Sitting across from Javier in the small, dimly lit visiting room of the county jail, Brandon saw a younger version of himself, scared, angry, and clinging to a fragile sense of hope. "I didn't do it," Javier said, his voice trembling. "They said I had a gun, but I've never even touched one." Brandon leaned forward, his expression calm and reassuring. "I believe you. We're going to do everything we can to prove it." As Brandon left the jail that day, he thought of the people who had fought for him when he felt most hopeless. He vowed to be that person for Javier and others like him. Clara remained a constant presence in Brandon's life. Her unwavering support, a source of strength. She often joined him at the advocacy office, helping with paperwork and mentoring younger volunteers. One evening, as they reviewed files together, she looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about what's next for you?" she asked. Brandon paused, considering her question. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "This work feels like where I'm supposed to be right now." Clara nodded. "It suits you, but don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You've been through so much, you deserve a life beyond this fight." Her words stayed with him, though he wasn't sure what they meant yet. Months later, Brandon and Paul sat in the courtroom as Javier's case was retried. The evidence they had uncovered, a witness who had been threatened, missing surveillance footage that had been recovered, proved pivotal. When the judge overturned Javier's conviction, Brandon felt a swell of pride and relief. As Javier embraced his family outside the courthouse, he turned to Brandon with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "You gave me my life back." Brandon shook his hand, his voice steady. "Now it's your turn to live it." That night, Brandon returned home, exhausted but content. He stood in his room, staring at the shelf where his model engine still sat, untouched since his release. With a small smile, he picked one up, his fingers tracing the intricate details. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about the future, not just the work he wanted to do, but the life he wanted to build. He thought of Clara's advice, of Paul's mentorship, of his mother's quiet strength. The fight for justice would always be part of him, but it didn't have to define him completely. He could have both a purpose and a life. As he set the model back on the shelf, Brandon felt a sense of peace settle over him. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He would face it with the same resilience and kindness that had brought him this far. The ripple effect of his story was still growing, touching lives he might never meet. And in that, Brandon found hope. The courthouse steps were quiet this time, no flashing cameras or jostling reporters. Brandon stood alone in the cool morning air, waiting for Javier Lopez and his family to emerge. It had been a week since Javier's conviction was overturned, and today marked his official release. Brandon felt a deep satisfaction as he watched Javier walk through the courthouse doors, free at last. The young man's mother ran to embrace him, tears streaming down her face. Brandon smiled, stepping forward to shake Javier's hand when their eyes met. "You did it," Javier said, his voice thick with emotion. Brandon shook his head. "We all did it. Now it's your turn to pay it forward." As Brandon walked away, he felt a sense of closure. Helping Javier had reminded him of his own release and the people who had stood by him. It reaffirmed his belief that change, real, meaningful change, started with small acts of kindness and courage. Life outside the courthouse continued to evolve for Brandon. The advocacy group had grown, its mission expanding beyond legal aid to include re-entry programs for those newly released from prison. Brandon found himself increasingly drawn to this aspect of the work, mentoring young men and women as they adjusted to life on the outside. One of his mentees, a soft-spoken teenager named Malik, had been released after serving time for a crime he didn't commit. Brandon saw echoes of himself in the boy, cautious but quietly determined. "I don't know how to start over," Malik admitted one afternoon as they sat in the office's modest break room. Brandon's journey reminds us of the transformative power of resilience, kindness, and the pursuit of justice. His story shows that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one act of courage can spark a ripple effect that changes lives. If Brandon's fight for justice moved you, consider supporting organizations that work tirelessly to free the wrongfully convicted and advocate for systemic reform. Together, we can build a system that values truth and fairness for everyone. For more stories of resilience, hope, and the fight for justice, subscribe to our channel. Let us continue to inspire and challenge the way we see the world, because sometimes the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins there. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.